Welcome, friends, to episode 24 of Jen and Matt Talk About the Bible. Today in our lectionary reading, we are looking at the parable of the talents, which we find in Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. I'm going to actually get Matt to go ahead and read this for us, because I think that's going to just help our context a lot.
Sure. The beginning of this chapter, so this is actually like a story. Jesus tells like a few stories in a row.
Right.
In the beginning of the chapter, he says, then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. And this is a continuation of that. So this is a parable talking about what the kingdom of heaven is like.
Yeah.
For it is if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. One of them he gave 5 talents. And so a talent is just a truckload of money. It's a lot of money.
Truckload.
It is. It's a lot.
That's great.
And so he gave him 5, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents, doubled his money. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with each of them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing his 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more. As in, like, he's giving back all 10 of them, right? Mm-hmm. His master said to him, well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you've handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made you 2 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you are a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The end.
Awesome.
Okay. Here we go.
Okay, so so truckload of cash is what this is. It actually, there's a note here, a talent is worth more than 15 years of wages. That is a truckload of money. That's a lot. It's a lot.
I know I've preached on this before, and I might do this again, I don't know, but I often work out like, look up what is the average salary in Canada, like the median salary in Canada, and like work out like how much money that actually is.
It's crazy.
It's a lot of money.
And so, I mean, the thing that, just to start off at the beginning, where the man going on a journey, he summons his slaves and entrusts his property to them. And so he splits up this property, and it doesn't really say much about like giving any instructions of what they are supposed to do, aside from giving to each of them according to his ability. Now, is his as their ability, or the
I think it's
owner?
The slave's ability.
Well, that's what I kind of think. It's a little vague, but and then he went away. So
I think like the normal interpretation of this passage, right, is about, and it's fun. It's a fine interpretation. Yeah, I think is like we all have gifts.
There's things that we are given.
God gives you an abundance of gifts, and we're supposed to use them and use them for the benefit of the world, and things multiply, and that's good. And God sees what we do and goes, "Great job, good and trustworthy servant."
Sure.
Awesome. That's a good interpretation, I think. I especially like that interpretation with the phrase, enter into the joy of your master. Mm-hmm. I like that.
Yeah, that's lovely.
It's kind of like end of your life. You've served God. You've used your gifts. You've served other people.
Yeah.
and enter into the joy of your master. Isn't that great? And then the one who doesn't do that, too bad.
Yeah.
So that's interpretation A. Mm-hmm. But I often wonder, like, is there another interpretation here? Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the clue or a clue to this might be asking, how is this parable like the kingdom of heaven? Because that's actually the starting point, is Jesus saying, okay, the kingdom of heaven is going to be like this, or is like this. And then he tells this story of, there's a man, a landowner, obviously, goes on a journey, entrusts his property, which is in the form of money, to them, and kind of divides it unequally between different servants. How is that like, what is Jesus actually describing here? I wonder. Any thoughts on that?
The only thought I have, if we're thinking about the kingdom of heaven is like, and we've got a property owner who divides up his property and gives that, I can only equate that as creation, because I don't think money for me doesn't really work.
Right. Yeah, I totally,
what are we, I'm not going to have.
I totally agree. I think this is actually about stewardship.
Yes.
In the big sense of the word.
Yes.
Stewardship is often equated with money as well, mm-hmm. right? Stewardship is like, we're going to have a stewardship campaign in the church and try to figure out how do we convince people to give money to the church.
Right. But money didn't even really exist when creation was created.
Right. But stewardship this is actually a story that describes stewardship.
Yeah.
Like in a very real way, mm-hmm. right? Like there's someone who is the owner mm-hmm. who goes away. The people who left to manage it, that's what a steward is.
Right.
So they're stewarding what God has given. And we could do that with our gifts too and say, actually, these gifts that we get from God, they're not really, like we are to steward our gifts, right. Not like exercising our gifts is to be good stewards of them. Sure. But it widens, like what you're saying, creation mm-hmm. Is a form of like, that's stewardship as well. We've been given the earth mm-hmm. And we are to steward it.
Yeah.
Like we're to take care of it.
So my short summary then is therefore plant some trees. Trying to simplify.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. Like what else do you have for that? It's being a good steward and not being afraid to try to multiply creation or increase it.
Sure.
That's what I feel like it says.
Sure. Okay. I don't know what multiplying creation looks like.
Well, not causing it to be destroyed would be a good starting point for me.
Sure, but I mean, you could read it as saying, well, let's extract all the natural resources we can.
Oh, gross. Yeah, you can. You could read it that way. That is not what I am saying, folks. Definitely not saying that.
Yeah. I wonder too about like the different, like if we're maybe supposed to read it, if this is about stewardship of everything.
Sure.
So creation, our money, our gifts, like everything we've been given, then what about the different reactions of the various stewards? Mm-hmm. You can call them stewards rather than slaves, I guess.
It's better.
How they respond differently, and then how the master, when he returns, responds differently. There's also like next week's text is the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is also a story of the king returning and sort of seeing how people have lived differently and then dealing with them differently. So this is actually kind of a similar story to that. So I think like, obviously the first two have done the right thing with their stewardship, whatever that means. In the context of this story, it's the taking a risk, actually.
Yep. And
being willing to risk the money to be able to try to make more for their master, so to try to multiply what has been given. And then the last slave, I think or the last steward, I guess, is to me the most interesting one. Mm-hmm. And what I think is most interesting is his conception of the owner, of the master. You're saying that knowingly.
Well, because I think we could have fear if we've got what we've been given, and if we have this perspective about God being, that God is going to judge us, and I'm trying to think, how did he phrase it? I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. I mean, I kind of have a little bit of a struggle equating that as God, but maybe that's what's being said here. And if we also look at the Amos text,
maybe not actually. It's not always a great practice. We do it all the time, but it's not always the best thing to, in a parable,
right,
go, okay, well, this character's God and this character's us,
trying to put it
and
all
this
into a little
character is
box.
like, that's actually not how parables tend to work. And actually that may be just kind of, for people watching this, the reason why it's called like that, a helpful way of understanding parables is to think of the word parallel, right? So you're basically laying the story, the parable, alongside our life. And there's often what are called multivalent or polyvalent meaning, which just means you have multi or poly, just lots. So instead of having a direct one-to-one correlation and saying, well, the landowner is clearly God, well, yeah, yes, but also the landowner might be somebody else. Maybe it is only God in this one. I don't know. But in parables, you don't have to have just one reading and one meaning. They're intentionally, Jesus told them intentionally in such a way that you can get multiple meanings from the different pieces. So that's kind of important.
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely. And because I don't love thinking of God in that kind of a manner.
Reaping where he didn't sow.
Yeah.
I don't love thinking about God as a harsh man.
Yeah.
But isn't this the point?
Yeah.
The third steward
Who didn't
has an incorrect conception of God.
Say more.
And well, so let's say he is talking about God. Okay?
Sure.
Or we're talking about God, and so he's like, well, I know God is really harsh, and God just and God's unfair, and God doesn't.
Right.
And,
so his way
of dealing with that is like, okay, I'm not going to take any risks. I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to make sure that I'm not doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
I haven't done anything wrong.
Stay on those straight and narrow path.
I'm going to just bury this and not really talk. Like, I won't interact with anybody. Like, just going to bury what you've given, put it in the hole in the ground, because I know you really punish mistakes.
It's interesting that if this is an incorrect perspective of God, which I kind of hope it is, then God's response is kind of almost fulfilling the perspective that the guy had of him. Okay, well, if that's what you think, well, then out you go where there's...
Yeah, but it's also kind of an interesting idea to think of, and maybe C.S. Lewis sort of had this a little bit in like The Great Divorce. That's one of my favorite novels, where like he has this conception of the afterlife, where people are like, sorry, it's a major leap here.
Okay, great.
People are living more and more isolated lives and are really having a terrible time with the loneliness, but are actually grumpy and don't want to go near anyone, and they move farther and farther away from each other, and they don't realize that they're living in hell, and they don't even necessarily realize that they've died.
Interesting.
And then the book kind of goes from there, but there's something in that kind of says like, well, and this is where it's a parable. Is God really saying, well, if you believe that's who I am, then that's who I am, off you go? Or is it more our own, like we've kind of created our own hell in a way, and we've actually, by picturing God in the wrong way and actually allowing our behavior to, like our life then just continues in the afterlife of also continuing to alienate ourselves from the true God, because we can't actually accept who God really is. As this loving and giving.
Wow. It's a good leap.
Love, right? Like, so maybe that's something that's going on. I don't know. That might be way, way far away from what I'm not going to preach that. I don't
Probably not,
Sunday,
but I liked it.
I do also think that there's this idea of when the third steward says, "Here, have what is yours," and that actually further feeds into the idea of not understanding who God is, because anyone who's saying, "Well, I knew that you reaped where you did not sow, and gathered where you did not scatter, and here have what is yours," they're basically saying, God, there are things that actually do belong to you, and there are things that belong to me, and there's things that belong to other people. And you claiming that you actually own everything? No. Right? Because he's saying, you can't, don't do anything to me. I own what I own. Here, okay, yeah, this was yours. Here you go. And now I'm good. Leave me alone. I think there's lots of people who actually behave that way, right? Instead of kind of going, wow, like, God, you've been so generous here. I'm not going to waste what you've given. I'm going to like lean into it and not just share it and do all the right things, but also enjoy it. And I don't know, that's maybe where the first two people are. I might read into that a little more, but that third slave is actually really telling how he has this idea that, okay, there's what you gave me, and I know you're harsh because you're reaping where you do not sow. And the question would be, well, isn't everything, isn't God sowing everywhere? Like, is God actually reaping where God doesn't sow?
That's a good question.
No.
Does he know?
Like, isn't God reaping where God sows?
So then so if that's kind of, I feel like that's one of the points, as you mentioned, this multi things that we can extract from it. Then what is that to say? Like, why is Jesus sharing this story to say the kingdom of heaven will be like this?
Yeah.
Is he actually, because he doesn't repeat that at verse 14 where we started. He does that 25:1.
No, it's a continuation. So you have the parable
right?
of the
So is this more
bridegroom.
like, okay, so the kingdom of heaven is like this. We got the 10 bridesmaids who took the lamps.
Yep. Which is like, be ready is the
Yep. Be prepared.
the normal interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, but it's not quite like this. And maybe part of the being ready is like, what is your perspective about who God is? What is your interaction
Yeah, maybe.
with God
Yeah.
and the kingdom?
And then I think like the next one we're going to talk about too is the parable of the sheep and the goats, like we said.
Yeah.
And that might be more about, well, okay, if we're actually receiving like the talents, whatever those are,
Sure.
the money, like, okay, well, how are we supposed to live? But then there's a surprise in that story too, because the people, well, we'll get to it. There's a surprise in there. The people don't actually know that they have done the right thing in their life. They're kind of surprised by it. So, but yeah, I think that is a good question of, well, why does Jesus tell this story as a way of illustrating what the kingdom of heaven is like? I don't know. I kind of like the stewardship answer to that, to say, well, I think maybe Jesus is trying to say like that it's also all encompassing. Like, God is the king of this, and you can't just separate out and say, well, I'm not part of that. Like, it seems like the third slave is trying to say, well, you're over there and I'm scared of you.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to participate in what you're doing.
I think that's really important.
And then the landowner goes, okay, then
Out you go.
you're not going to participate. Like that.
Yeah. The other stewards might also be afraid, but they respond differently.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like, I don't know, I kind of pictured those first two stewards as like enthusiastic.
Right.
Oh my goodness, you just gave me all this money. I can't believe that. here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the traders and try to make more, and it's going to be amazing. Mm-hmm. And so they have this very different abundance outlook. And yes, they have more, but like we have to remember that like the one talent is not
It's huge.
like 15 years of salary.
It's
So
a lot.
It's not like, oh, he only got a little bit, so it's a little harder to risk your.
No.
It
is
not
big.
What's going on?
It is big.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll have to stay tuned to see what unfolds with this text on Sunday.
Yeah. And then next week, the next one, we'll get into that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Awesome, friends. Thanks for being with us. Have yourself a great rest of the week.